wanted to remove the northeast corner so they could exclude, so they could drive a railroad to Cook City for the mines to get up into there. And the morning that Congress voted whether to allow railroads through the park or to remove that section, there's a whole story. It's really funny. I think Lee talks about it in the Cinnabar book too. The park superintendent at the time, and I forget his name, and someone else here in Livingston were going to claim jump. They were ready to jump in there and stake all their claims out of that, all along Soda Bean Creek first, right? So the guy telegraphs from Livingston to Cinnabar, telling him that it's a go, you know, to this guy, go ahead and do it. Well, they voted against it. He got the message wrong. Well, they got caught, you know, because then someone said, hey, what are you doing? So the superintendent got kicked out, the government withdrew him, and it was a big to-do about this whole thing. They're trying to preempt property is what they were trying to do. A whole other story, right? Things were really bad in the park. A lot of damage. There was poaching going on all over the park. People were destroying the geyser basins, the geysers. They were knocking big pieces out of them to take as souvenirs. They think Old Faithful from the early pictures, it was probably another 15 feet higher than it is today. That's how much was chipped off of it for souvenirs and so forth, and everything else in the area too. We're going to get a little bit into the concessions here a little bit later too, but things were bad. People were coming. In 1883, the railroad gets here and they push their line down to Cinnabar, so they're bringing people. Now they're bringing a lot of people into the park. 1883 is one of those spike years. You see the numbers just jumping. Because now you can get on a railroad in New York City and you can ride the railroad all the way to Cinnabar. You know, and go in, and then get off, and there was the Park County guys with their horses and buggies taking you into the park. Several of those which we discovered this summer that were working. So things were really bad. The hotels were really poor. The food was bad. The whole thing was bad. And these are rich people, so they're complaining. They're complaining a lot. So the government, in its infinite wisdom, actually we're going to jump back to, I think, 1883. The Secretary of the Interior is having problems, not just with Yellowstone, but the whole western United States, like they always do. He slips in a rider into a bill, one of those little riders they attach on bills. And in this rider, it basically states that the Secretary of the Interior has the right to call upon the United States military to administer lands under his control if need be. Okay, slipped it in there. There it is, sitting there. No one paid any attention to it. 1886 comes along, everybody's complaining about Yellowstone. Superintendents are being thrown out, you know, all this, you know, stuff's going on, people are complaining. Say, why are you doing this? The Montana people say, why don't you just give us the park, we can run it better. Wyoming wants it. So the government, in their infinite wisdom in 1886, decide the way to deal with it is just to cut off all funding to the park. So in the budget that year, the Yellowstone Park budget disappears. There's no money. They can't pay for the superintendent, they can't pay for his gamekeepers, nothing. So everybody just leaves. The administration just packs up and leaves. Secretary of the Interior, right, that little rider, he gets a hold of General Philip Sheridan. General Philip Sheridan had been in the park in 1883 with President Chester A. Arthur, and he loved the park. He thought it was great. They spent a lot of time fishing and hunting in there at the time. Anyway, he agrees. He says, yeah, we can do that, no problem. He sends in the United States Cavalry, rides to the rescue. In 1886, Company M out of Minnesota gets orders to move into Yellowstone National Park and take over administration of the park. They figured they're only going to be there for a few years until the government figures out what they want to do. Okay, this is 1886. They're there until 1918. 32 years in Yellowstone. That's why you have Fort Yellowstone. And the U.S. military really were the ones who developed all the beginnings of the rules and regulations for Yellowstone National Park. They had backcountry, all the backcountry cabins and main areas were set up by the military to begin with. They stationed guys all over the park. They stationed groups of guys at all the entrances, out at Riverside, which is the west entrance before West Yellowstone existed, at the lake, at the canyon, at Old Faithful, at Mammoth, and all the little backcountry. And they patrolled. They started, cracking down on the poachers and so forth, and stopping people in the Upper Geyser Basin. They would walk patrols through the Upper Geyser Basin, the military would. And one of their favorite things was, and I could see these guys, because these are military guys. Now, a lot of your privates and so forth, that wasn't the best of our Army in the 1880s. Probably a lot of alcoholics and so forth. The officers are all bored because they don't want to be there, because you're not going to go anywhere in the military being stuck in a national park. You want to be out fighting Indians or whatever, right? Building up your resume. So what they would do is they'd issue one of the big, jumping back and forth, one of the big things tourists were doing were writing their names in the runoff channels, right? Describing your name. Linda, I was here 1886, right? So these soldiers would go around and they were all issued toothbrushes. And they'd catch you. And you got to get down there on your hands and knees with that toothbrush and scrape your name out of the runoff
In
channels.
stone or sand?
No, in the runoff channels, like in the
geysers.
The geysers, the hot springs runoff channels.
Oh, okay.
You know where the hot water's
So it
flowing?
would be soft limestone,
Yeah.
Paul?
Well,
Oh, okay.
it's not limestone. Limestone at Mammoth, it's silica and Old Faithful.
Oh, okay.
It's a different mineral, but it's really soft. So they'd get out there and they'd make you scrape your name out. Then they'd march you back to the hotel and kick you out of the Upper Geyser Basin. So then people are complaining about the Army being, too heavy-handed. Poaching was a real problem, and they wanted to stop the poaching, and they were trying to get the government to pass a law to stop hunting in the park. Well, prior to that, there was no law that said you couldn't hunt in the park. And people weren't necessarily going in there hunting. They were going in there taking hundreds of elk and, for hide hunters and so forth. So the military had a really good thing. What they do is they'd catch a poacher in the backcountry, and they'd take all of his gear and stash his gear where they'd catch him. They'd turn his horse loose, and they'd march him on foot back to Mammoth Hot Springs and put him in the stockade. Then they would telegraph back to Washington, D.C., asking what to do. Well, they got this game going, and the guy back in Washington, D.C. goes, oh, I'll deal with that telegraph. I'm busy. I'll get to that. So it sits there a week or two. And eventually it goes to the Solicitor General. And he looks at it. It might be a couple of months. And so he telegraphs back and says, well, there's no laws. You got to let the guy go. Oh, okay, you're free. You can go. It was a calm.
Bill had a question or a comment.
Yeah.
You skipped 1875. Have you ever heard of William Ludlow?
Oh, yeah.
He was in the park
Right.
then, and he was an Army engineer. And
Right.
he was one of the first ones. When he came out, he said that they needed the Army in there
Yeah.
because they were
Yeah.
wrecking the park then.
Yeah.
But he got tied up, with that thing
Yeah.
in the June of '76. So,
Right.
it kind of went by the wayside.
Yeah, there's a lot of different stories.
Yeah.
A lot going on.
He had some good maps.
Yeah. And Barlow Peak too, Barlow was in there too. But
Yeah.
Something I'm not able to connect the dots. How did poachers know where the park boundaries were at that
Oh, they
point in
didn't.
time?
There probably was a blazed trail, but there wasn't like it is today where it's
So
clear cut.
if there were poachers,
But
they
they
weren't
did.
necessarily, that they knew that they were in a reserve or a preserve?
Some of them did.
Some of them
I mean,
did,
you get far
okay.
enough in there, you're in the park.
How would you know?
When you catch them in the Hayden Valley, you're in the park,
Oh, okay. Yeah.
or on the Pitchstone Plateau or something.
Well, I can understand if there's geothermal,
Oh, yeah.
features there, you would know that.
I
But
think
so
those
much of
people- I
Yellowstone
think
just
those
looks like
people were
Park
a lot
County.
Smarter than we think of.
Okay.
They kind of knew,
Okay.
they knew where they were, but anyway.
Another interesting note in that on Ludlow is that they were in the park June, July, and August of '75. They saw 2 deer, and they saw them at Mammoth. And so when you start talking about poachers, what were they poaching?
Elk mostly and bison were still in there.
But they didn't see any, and they said that in the 3 months they were in the summer,
Yeah.
it rained every day.
They're working on it, Paul Schilleri and Lee Whittlesey did a big research on the wildlife in the park for the reintroduction of the wolf. And there was a lot of game in there. Those guys didn't see anything. Other people were seeing them all over the place.
Did it get rid of the wolverines? I heard that there were wolverines in
Yeah,
the
I
park and
could
there
be,
was some
but-
poaching period. Okay. And they were gone.
Getting all over, anyway, so the military's there. Remember Doane, Gustavus Doane, he was with the Washburn Langford Doane expedition? He wanted to be a big explorer. he wanted to be like the guys going to the North Pole and the South Pole. So he decides to do a winter trip through Yellowstone in 1876. And there's the Schwatka expedition, which there's too many to get into. He failed later. But anyway, Doan takes his guys, they go through the park in the middle of winter. They go down through Old Faithful, they go down through the lake, and it's hard, it's tough. And they get down to the Snake River, and they decide finally the Snake River's free, they can float on the Snake River. They get down into the Snake River Canyon where you float today, the big float, and of course they lose their boats, they get wiped out in the rapids of the Snake River. So they make their way down to Fort Hall, Idaho, and regroup, and Doan wants to continue, he wants to float the Snake River. His guys are tired of it. So they had cached a bunch of stuff in the Snake River Canyon below Jackson there. So he sends a sergeant and a group of guys to go back up and get their canoes and their stuff, and the sergeant comes back and says, oh, that stuff was all caught in the ice, and the ice crushed it all and broke the canoes all up, so there's nothing we could do with it. The thought is that sergeants being smarter usually than captains probably went up there, chopped the canoes up and threw them away. If he would have tried floating the rest of the Snake, going down to Twin Falls in that area, he would have been in real trouble. But Doan wanted to be, when the military got in, he wanted to get stationed in there. And they never put him in there for whatever reason. But he was in this area a lot. He actually married Mary Hunter, I think. She's married. One of the hunters from Hunter's Hot Springs marries him. And they end up settling in Bozeman and Doan. But that's a whole other story out there. So along comes the railroad, 1882. The railroad reaches here, 1883. They have a line down to Cinnabar. Oh, I should mention 1883. Dan Kingman, who was Army Corps of Engineers, starts laying out. He's responsible for the layout of our basic figure-8 road system we have. It's been changed a little over the years, but he did kind of the basic layout on that. But the Northern Pacific Railroad, they got here, and of course they were doing their transcontinental, and they ran that line immediately down because they wanted to start bringing tourists to Yellowstone. 1883, they go through the canyon down here. Mr. Ebert from the Ebert Apartments over here gets the contract to blast through the canyon and blast through Pointer Rocks. They take some 6 tons of dynamite to get through those 2 areas for the railroad, and his talking about his work on the thing. But the Northern Pacific Railroad, they had greater ideas than just going to Cinnabar. They were going to put their railroad all the way through the park. In 1882, they actually sent a survey party out, led by an M.G. Grant, and Grant's Pass is a pass south of Old Faithful that drops down into the Shoshone Geyser Basin. It's named after him. People think that was U.S. Grant that was named after. But in 1934, Samuel B. Patton, who was a member of the 82 survey, writes a reminiscence in the form of a long letter, and this was published in the Wyoming Annals, is where I got this out of. Anyway, they reached the site of Livingston in March of 1882. The survey is ordered to survey a branch line to and through Yellowstone National Park. So they lay out that first line. They complete mostly light work in the open country and we're at Gardner by the end of March. They were supposed to go up the Yellowstone River to the lake. They found that wasn't going to work, so they went up to Mammoth, up over the top, dropped down, kind of the west side of the road now, down to the Norris Geyser Basin. They had a really hard time getting through the lower Geyser Basin and around Norris because of all the hot water in the areas. They take a day off and they go spend the 4th of July at the Grand Canyon. And before the end of August, they're at the Upper Geyser Basin, which they thought was really good for doing laundry. Old Faithful was a really great place to do laundry, according to his letter. And then they go down, they go over Grants Pass, go down to Shoshone Lake. Then they come back up, they turn around, they meet Sheridan's coming up to the park with Chester A. Arthur, and they meet him in the south end of the park. They turn around and they come back up to Shoshone Lake and they survey a line over to Yellowstone Lake. And then they come back up to Old Faithful, and then they decide they're going to leave the park, so they go down and they survey out the Madison River out to the west entrance and out and up over. They were going to go down and drop down the Gallatin River. And of course at the Gallatin River, they get word, catches up with the mail that the government has said, no, we're not going to build railroads so forget your survey. Go back and fix up the line from Livingston south. But they did actually run a survey line all the way through the park, down and out to the south entrance on the Lewis River. And it was really interesting, something that didn't happen. Wouldn't that been interesting if they would have put a train through the park? Things might have been different. Patton wrote about Grant. He was an extraordinary man. He was 62 years old and could stand more hardship than any of the young men in the party. Patton wondered what kind of elixir kept him going. He suspected that Grant achieved his extraordinary energy by chewing cocoa leaves. Is familiar with what you get from cocoa leaves? Cocaine. He'd done a big survey and mapping in South America prior to coming back and working for the Northern Pacific Railroad. And he brought a big stash of cocoa leaves with him, and he was
Who is this?
Grant, the surveyor, the National Park surveyor. And they still do that today in the high Andes. When they hike around up there, they chew cocoa leaves for the energies. It's an interesting little side story. Lots of stories. I mean, the well is so deep out there, it's unbelievable. So let's get to tourists, because otherwise we're going to run too late. I know you guys just can't wait to do your business here.
Not.
We're going to run through some stuff really quick.
So interested in this.
The tourists come along, of course, the railroad gets here, they start going through the park, the stagecoach companies, hotels are being built. There were 5 stagecoach holdups in the park. The first one on July 4th, 1887, and the last one on July 9th in 1915, which was one of the last years of stagecoaches in the park. 5 different stagecoach robberies in the park. There's a whole book written on that, a whole little book written on that. It's kind of interesting. One of the fun ones, Lee Whittlesey, doing research in newspapers back back east, found an account in a New York newspaper, not New York City, but a New York newspaper, a banker who was on one of those stagecoaches. He got robbed of $20, which was a lot of money, and I forget which year it was he was on, which one he was on. But he writes about the stagecoach robbery, and he said, I lost $20 in my pocket watch. He said it was the best $20 I've ever spent in my life. He said, who'd believe it, that, because it must have been one of the early 1900s. They were driving cars everywhere. It's getting held up by a stagecoach robber in the Wild West. He thought that was great. He thought it was the best $20 he ever spent.
And was it always white men robbing them or Indians?
It was white men, pretty much, yeah. The Native Americans were gone at that point.
Kay has a relative by marriage that
It was probably George Reeb for one of those holdups.
Yeah,
was a
Is what?
stagecoach.
George Reeb.
George Reeb, yeah.
My great cousin, my great cousin, he was a driver, stagecoach driver that got
Well,
killed.
yeah, and what was really common on a couple
Really?
of them, they would separate those coaches, because otherwise you'd get all the dust from the coach in front of you.
Yeah.
So they'd string them out, and the guys would, one of them did like 25 stagecoaches. He'd stop a coach and just, throw all your money out and all your wallets out, then he'd go, move on. The coach would move on, and then he'd get the next one to come in. Until they, get afraid that the guy up front was gonna catch up with somebody. And eventually the military started escorting the coaches too. But there were 5 stagecoach robberies in the park. And then, the tourists, that's a whole huge story. We could talk about tourists. Talk a little bit about